Thank you very much, Mary. My name is Amy Thompson. I'm a director on the board of the BC Association of Specialized Victim Assistance and Counselling Programs, and I'm also the agency coordinator for the Central Okanagan Elizabeth Fry Society, which delivers community-based victim assistance and STV outreach. I'm here to introduce Suzanne DeLynn this morning. She's the Executive Director of Victim Services and Crime Prevention Division of BC and of the BC Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General. The division develops and funds programs and initiatives that help British Columbians build and maintain safe communities and support victims of crime and their families. Suzanne has worked in the criminal justice field as a policy analyst, probation officer, family court counselor, researcher in the provincial government, and as a parole officer and consultant for the federal government. In addition, Suzanne has coordinated the Native Criminal Justice Training Program for the Native Education Centre and Douglas College. She has also worked in the community as a daycare advocate. She was a founding member of the Northern Women's Centre in Thunder Bay of Ontario, the editor of the Northern Women newsletter, and a past president and founder of the Association for Women in the Justice System, an organization that was established some 20 years ago to address the issues of women as offenders, victims, and workers in the justice system. So please help me welcome Suzanne.
Thanks very much, Amy, and good morning, everyone. And I have to say, I probably should update some things a little bit, because when I say 20 years ago, I'm thinking, it might have been a bit longer than that, folks. But anyway, we won't go there. Mary already made mention of that, some of our histories. First of all, I want to acknowledge the First Nations territory in which we have been welcomed and invited this morning, and thank you very much. I, too, bring greetings from the Honourable John Van Dongen, the Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General. As Mary mentioned, our ministers have been called into the House this morning, and unfortunately it is probably to deal with some severe budget issues, not only in this province, but across the country and internationally that we're all facing. So we need to stay tuned to what that is going to look like. But clearly, as the minister, he's made a strong commitment in this area, and I've heard his commitment personally, and if he had a way, he would have been here, but was unfortunate to be here. I want to just say this morning that this forum has drawn together extraordinary women and men from a wide range of professions and experiences. And because I have been around dealing with these issues for a number of years, I do know how extraordinary a lot of those people are and how their commitment and dedication has been over a number of years. Today, you are all coming to Richmond to share knowledge and wisdom garnered from across BC and around the world. And I say yes, I think it is wisdom that a lot of us have now developed in this field. Some of the presenters and participants in this symposium have been active for over 3 decades of longer, and many have given 20 years or more. But you know, also when I look around the room, and even when I look at who introduced me this morning, I'm gratified to see the number of young women and people involved in this room. And while I see that there are some male faces in the room, not enough to have their own washroom, but anyway, hopefully we can eventually move in that direction and have more men working in this field as well. What I find gratifying is that because of the work you have already done, we are no longer just responding to violence. The topic of this forum is ending violence through assessment and planning. Ending violence, of course, feels idealistic, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. Ideals become goals when we find ways to reach them. And this is the purpose of this forum, finding ways to make sure that clients and frontline workers are safe. And I think that Mary mentioned that as well, that this is a very unsafe field, unfortunately, to work in. But as well as ending violence, and I think we've come to a stage in our life, and I think it's been reflected in other areas and issues, in some places in politics, even across the border, that it's a time of looking to goals and ideals and trying to move us towards there. It's now becoming we can and we will. I have to say that I sometimes reflect back on, have we really moved forward in this field? And you can look and say when you're welcomed by the videos that we were welcomed with, not videos, the news events of recent, you sometimes become a little bit pessimistic and depressed and say, have we really moved forward? Look at what's happening around us. But I think Mary mentioned it as well, that when you talk to the police many years ago, no one acknowledged this violence. I'm going to talk about my age a little bit too, must be the day that we do this, that I was around when Margaret Mitchell stood up in the House of Commons many years ago and talked about spousal violence, and she was laughed at publicly because how could she even talk about that happening in the country of Canada? Now, of course, we are acknowledging, which is the first step to ending, is starting to acknowledge and bring it out of the closet and talk about it. The other piece that we're starting to acknowledge, I went to the forum of South Asian women last night who are talking about violence in their community. And they're talking about not only spousal violence now, and there are many powerful women there talking about the abuse that happened to them, but they also started to talk about sexual violence in their community. And there's another area of violence that has for far too long been in the closets, and now they are coming out and talking about it. And in some communities, it's still very taboo to talk about that. And Shashi, I think, said, and everybody knows Shashi Asanan, who is one of our funded community-based programs, said that she felt proud of her community that they are starting to talk about this issue publicly and taking it out of the closet. Not all communities are there yet, but I think the more that we can talk about it and expose it and share it, the more people are willing to come forward. The other thing I felt good about last night, although we're dealing with a very depressing topic, is the fact that, first of all, I had to sit in the overflow room, the full audience. It was full, no one could get in, so that was gratifying to see. And you know what? It was all young people. Again, I was probably one of the oldest ones in the crowd, and that was really good to see that there are young people out there talking about these issues, asking about these issues. And also, the other gratifying thing was that there were a lot of young men there. And I think, again, Ninu Kang, another person from our community-based programs, talked about men's violence and how men are brought up and how they feel, how they are given the power to be able to do what they do. And I think she really spoke to that issue very eloquently. And again, I think it's a lot of raising awareness out there, which is one of the big pieces we have to do with young people if we really want to stop this from continuing. So I digressed from my speech a little bit. Now I'm lost. So the belief in the potential that we can actually end violence is why we are in this field today and why we are all here today. And I think we have lots of people who have fought a lot of struggles, and they're still out there fighting the struggles because they actually do believe they can end violence. And I believe that too, and that's why I've been in the field so long. By understanding that the root causes of violence, we then can look at alternatives to violence. So I think we've come deeper, that we're really starting to look at where the violence comes from and how we can address those root causes. Can we help women and children safe through timely and comprehensive coordinated assessments is what we're talking about here today. And can we learn from those who have experienced violence to help others live free from violence? I want to acknowledge the association today that they have created, and always create, I have to say. It is, Mary, I agree with you, this is usually one of the best conferences in terms of content and in terms of leading edge analysis in terms of these issues. And again, this year, they have moved that forward. And I want to acknowledge Jane Coombe, because Jane Coombe from my staff, cutting edge all the time, has been able to make those connections, and I want to acknowledge that from you, Jane. They have created a very special event today to address those questions. Creating stronger safety nets will provide practical information and advice. And this forum, as I said before, reaffirms that ending the violence is not just an ideal, but in fact, it is a real goal, and one that we can and will reach together. Those are comments that I think our Solicitor General would have given today, and I want to give those on behalf of him. And he had a look at these words, except for my digression, of course, and fully supported what I presented. And now I just want to talk a little bit about the division because, of course, I am the Executive Director of the Victim Service Crime Prevention Division, and I just want to talk a bit about what we've been doing over the last year. Just want to say that I think this last year in the division has been a year of tremendous significance for us. So we've started to focus on a strong, innovative service of delivery to victims and enhanced crime prevention initiatives. We've started with our Victim Service Delivery Analysis, VISDA project, most of you probably know about. And with that, we consulted with justice and community partners as well as frontline workers, and I'm sure most of you were at one of our forums that we recently held across the province, about ideas and strategies to strengthen our services across the province. So not only are we looking at continuing the services that we do and providing more funding for those services, because indeed we recognized over the last number of years that we fell behind in terms of that areas, but we also did a lot of research in this area. We looked at best practices. We piloted best practices to say that we also have to do things differently because you can never continue to do things the same. We're a growing field. The area of victim services is very new in the whole area of the criminal justice process. So we're always growing and developing and learning, and we're looking at research and best practices, and we tend to do a bit of funding in that area so that we are looking at what are cutting edge techniques to move forward and look at how we can do things differently and better. So I just want to say that we want to thank all of you here who contributed to those forums. I understand they were very active dialogues, and with all of the information that we received from those forums, from our literature review, from the surveys that we did with our justice system partners, we will be developing a strategic action plan that comes out of that. The VISTA project aims to ensure that funding provides the best system of support for British Columbians impacted by crime and violence, and that services are integrated, inclusive, and accessible. And I just want you to know that integration of service delivery, a client-centered approach, is something that we're looking at not only at the division level, but across the government. And again, I think Mary made mention of that in terms of how we across ministries recognize and understand how we need to work more closely together in terms of provision of service. So in March of 2008, the BC government increased funding for services to victims by $5.2 million for the year from the Victim Surcharge Special Account. As I said, we boosted funding to all our community-based and police-based programs and introduced a worker self-care initiative to help support the staff that provide these vital services on the front lines, because we do recognize that this work does impact the people that do the work as well. The funding also enables the development of new services to meet the needs of vulnerable and high-risk victims, with a focus we've identified on 4 key areas. Aboriginal victims of crime, and I think that when my staff were introduced today, the ones that were here, my new staff person, Renee Robert, was introduced as well, and she's my new Aboriginal Victim Service Program Manager, and I hope you take the opportunity to connect with her today. So she's leading actually how we're rolling out new services to Aboriginal victims of crime. Victims of family and sexual violence. We have done a lot of work in this area already, and Jane has been one of the leading analysts in this area for domestic violence, but we also know that we need to do more work in responding to victims of sexual violence, and we've identified that as a priority in terms of the work that we'll be doing over the next few years. And of course, children, youth, and other vulnerable victims. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of responding to children and youth. We have been doing some work with Ministry of Children and Family Development in terms of coordinating those responses, and we'll continue to do that. And when we talk about vulnerable victims, we're talking about, again, I think Mary mentioned our aging population, and we know the aging population also means that unfortunately many of our senior citizens, our elderly people, are victims of violence, abuse, and other types of crime, and we need to look specifically at responding to those particular victims. And of course, we need to look at the delivery of services and resources for victims through the criminal justice court process. Even though we've made gains in terms of how victims are treated through the criminal justice process, we still have a long way to go, and we need advocates within those systems who look through a victim's lens and provide victim support, and we need to have workers there that can deal with that. So ensuring that victims of crime access to the services, support, and information they need to assist them in dealing with the aftermath of crime remains central to our work as well. Oftentimes we have victim service programs, especially police-based victim service program, that are called in at the crisis response. Oftentimes they're there in the middle of the night to respond to victims, and so we're looking at how we can better respond in terms of crisis. We are also looking at new ways to prevent violence, and I think one of the things that, of course, we're aware of, the best, rather than trying to just deal with victims of violence, which we do, and we're really looking at how we can do that better, wouldn't it be better if we could prevent the violence in the first place? And I think that, again, the work that we're talking about, working with children and youth, working with men and boys, is a way to try and say, is there a way that we can really prevent violence before it starts? So as I have prevention of violence in my mandate, I'm looking at really trying to integrate my services so that all of our services start to look at and address prevention of violence. We also recently, as Mary suggested, we now have the mandate for the prevention of family violence, which was formerly under the Ministry of Community Services. But what we understand that even though we have the mandate, we can't do it alone. We know that. And we understand that by working cross-system, that we need to work on this together. It's a bigger problem than one ministry can do and respond to. So we will continue to work across systems and with our community partners in the development of evidence-based initiatives aimed at preventing violence before it starts. I am very pleased, and Mary started to talk a little bit about this, to announce that the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General is now leading the development of a new inter-ministry coordinating team on violence against women. Led by the Deputy Solicitor General, the team will bring together senior government officials from 10 ministries, including, and I could name them all, Attorney General, Children and Family Development, Education, Mary mentioned Housing and Social Development, Health Services, to develop an integrated cross-ministry strategy to address violence against women. I have to say that this is a significant step forward in our collective efforts to end violence against women, because what it says is that we, across the government, 10 ministries, 11 ministries, all have responsibility for this. It's coordinated through my ministry, but it's a coordinated effort, and we need to look at a systemic way to start to address this issue so that we can deal with it across government as a whole. It further demonstrates government's commitment to action and builds on recommendations contained in a number of coroner's inquests and, of course, the Keeping Women Safe report. The division as well has also continued to be active in justice reform initiatives to ensure that victims' voices are heard and that a victim's lens is put on all issues across the justice system. For example, we are involved in the province's first community court in Vancouver's downtown east side, working in collaboration with the Criminal Justice Reform Secretariat. And as I mentioned, we have enhanced capacity to support crime prevention efforts through the development of the Civil Forfeiture Crime Remediation and Crime Prevention Grant Funding Program. That's a partnership between the division and the Civil Forfeiture Office. And as a result of that, not only did we get additional money for our core program, but now we are receiving funding from the Civil Forfeiture Office, which is one-time only money, but last year we got $500,000 to provide to local community-based victim service programs, police-based victim service programs, other organizations to look at prevention of crime as well as victim programs in terms of one-time only grant funding. Last year we funded 27 projects to move this initiative forward. So as I said, this has been an exceptional year for enhancement and innovations in support and services to victims and their affected family members, and for integrated approaches to crime prevention and community safety. I recognize that we have and are moving forward. I also recognize that we are facing difficult times, which means that we need to be working more closely together in a more integrated way, and I trust that we can do that because we have done it before, and frankly, these are the groups that have always done it, and always done it really well, because we know that collaboration is the way we need to move forward and work. So in closing, I just want to wish each and every one of you a productive symposium. This is an ideal time to re-energize ourselves through learning, sharing, and reconnecting with our colleagues. And I want to thank you for your continued commitment and tireless efforts that each of you make in responding to victims of crime and violence. Thank you very much for your all hard work.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you for your support of our organization over the past years. Okay, so next up we have Raven Bowen and Susan Davis. Raven joined PACE in 1994 and was executive director of the Society from 2000 to 2005. As an award-winning community advocate with over 13 years' experience, Raven works to involve sex industry workers in community development and social change, and fights for sex worker leadership and inclusion in decision-making at all levels. As an alliance builder among community groups, law enforcement, sex workers, policymakers, and senior government officials, she inherited the coordination of the BC Coalition of Experiential Communities. Raven holds a certificate in liberal arts and is currently completing her degree in sociology at Simon Fraser University. She desires to continue her focus on policy development and social change through sex worker-led research and community economic and social development. Susan Davis has been a sex worker for 22 years and is a member of the BCCEC, I hope that she'll tell us what that stands for, the Sex Industry Worker Safety Action Group, in partnership with the Vancouver Police Department and the Living in Community Steering Committee, a citywide initiative to balance perspectives on the sex industry. Susan was a plaintiff in the charter challenges of the prostitution laws. She has also lectured at universities and colleges and trained almost 200 new recruits for the VPD, as well as members of the RCMP and the Department of National Defense. So please help me welcome Susan and Raven.
We have a PowerPoint. We're not sure how to work this thing.
Can we go to the quiet room? Can you help us hide out in the quiet room for a while? Okay, good morning, everyone. Sue and I, on behalf of the BC Coalition of Experiential Communities, would like to thank the association, as well as conference organizers and all of the attendees for inviting us to speak here today. I wanted to start, I finished the degree, by the way, so that was just an update on that, okay. Thank you. Okay, I wanted to start with just a brief introduction of the BC Coalition. We're a young organization of about 3.5 years, so we're toddlers. We are sex worker rights activists, and our purpose is to be a mechanism for experiential professionals. And these are individuals that have experience in the sex industry, as well as in community development, program planning, service delivery, community-based research, and the like. We consist of people that hold degrees in the School of Hard Knocks, like Sue, and individuals that hold college and university degrees. And we're also a place where people can test some of their ideas that have come out of their experiences in the sex industry, collaborate on community initiatives, sit at various tables, and influence policy, practice, and development in relation to sex industry work. Sometimes sex industry workers are seen as victimized, as incapable, incompetent, lacking in analysis, victims of patriarchy. But none of these are true of the sex workers that we know and the sex workers that we are and were. Sex workers are resilient, they're innovative and resourceful, and they possess an analysis that either comes from their lived experience, from their experience in service delivery, or from their formal education. And sex worker activists are uniting all over the world to resist these kinds of labels that silence them, but also to come to collaborate with people like you. We want to collaborate to develop programs and test some of our ideas so that we can participate in anti-violence work and strategies that serve us all. So in our info sheet today, we have a listing of our past projects and some of our current projects, as well as some future projects that we're seeking support for, so if you have a look in the package. And so I'll pass the floor over to, okay, great. I'll pass the floor over to Sue, and she's gonna talk about a little bit about the history of sex work, and then I'll come back and I'll talk about risk.
So I'm Sue, and as they said, I'm an active sex worker of 22 years, and the BCCEC is the BC Coalition of Experiential Communities. We have men, trans, women, all varying races, capacities, and genres of sex work on the coalition. So I'd just like to share a little bit about a project we did in partnership with Simon Fraser University called the History of Sex Work Project, just to sort of put into perspective our view of what has happened to make the situation so dangerous in the downtown east side, and just to sort of put our ideas into context. So here we are in the first one. This is a young lady from Vancouver. All of these pictures are local girls. In Vancouver, from the 1920s all the way up to the 1970s, the sex industry enjoyed peaceful and profitable times, and largely, for the most part, it existed in what were then called supper clubs, where a gentleman or a couple could be entertained with a nice dinner.
Should we advance it?
Yep,
Okay.
there they are cooking dinner. And the next one, this is the Palomar. You can see the girls in the front, where you could find an escort to keep you company. And of course, next one, you can watch a nice Las Vegas style dance performance. Here you go. These are all really quick. Dancers, escorts, cigarette girls, waitresses, bartenders, all working together under one roof. This was a community where everyone was able to work within their own physical boundaries, within a supportive environment, and of course, in retrospect of today, relatively safe work environment. So during these times, the sex industry was socially acceptable, and it didn't bear the same extreme stigma that we see today. Here you can see the Governor General of Canada, an RCMP officer in uniform, and children all in the Exotic Show Lounge at Christmas time. No shame, no stigma, no big media circus, just a community celebrating at Christmas time. Slowly but surely, though, over time, a religious movement called social gospel kicked in and saw the formation of the women's suffragettes, has whittled away at our safe work environments, and has mounted a huge campaign to cast sex workers as the vector of disease. Here you can see she's a carrier. This one is easy to get. This campaign continues to this day, and it's impacted sex workers, in particular women, through the stigma they must endure and, of course, the violence that it causes. This movement has separated sex workers from the greater community and pushed us out to the margins, and of course shamed anybody who dared to engage with us. Here you can see Hitler, the Emperor of Japan, and a sex worker all arm in arm, and she, of course, is the worst of the three. So here we go, next one. So in 1975, the Penthouse Show Lounge was shut down, and the old owners, the Filipponi brothers, were charged with living off the avails of prostitution for allowing escorts to come into the club to meet their customers. Immediately, the result was that no supper club owners were willing to work with sex workers anymore. And of course, the street trade in Vancouver shot through the roof, and the first recorded murder of a sex worker in the city of Vancouver took place. To us, of course, this is a direct result of an uninformed action taken against our community. So we believe this is the first in a series of events that have led to the evolving of the dangerous situation that we see in the downtown east side today. Here you can see the mortality rate of sex workers jumps in reactions taken to actions taken against our community. So nothing until 74, 75 till 79, 3, 80 to 84, only 8, 85, the year of the law revisions, there's a huge jump there. Same thing goes 90 to 94, numbers are still really high, and of course we weren't allowed to use the hotels in Lower Hastings anymore to entertain our clients. I remember when that happened myself, and of course, since then the situation has only gotten worse, and we all know what the end result is. Recently, the targeting of health enhancement centers and increased enforcement against exotic show lounges has once again jeopardized the safety of sex industry workers. Exotic dancers are being forced to choose sex industry work which is beyond their physical boundaries and become escorts, and of course entering a job market which is already strained to the max. Okay, next one. So what should we do to reduce harms and risk for our community? The coalition has engaged with sex workers in a number of projects over a few years, and we came up with a bit of a plan. It's a two-tiered plan, as you can see here. This isn't a little handout that I left on the table, so don't try to read it all. There's copies of all of this stuff out there free for you to take. So where's the next one? It involves two tiers, okay, localized, okay, first of all, an industry association. The lack of industry-wide health and safety and labor standards and the desperate need for a community-based complaints process has led to the harm and exploitation of many sex industry workers. Also, business owners who do provide safe work environments are seldom recognized as such and are lumped in with the less honorable business owners and targeted in blanket enforcements. We are working on these ideas. We're waiting for a proposal in front of the Ministry of the Solicitor General. We're hoping to get that project rolling a bit more. And of course, through localized cooperative development. Every municipality and region across Canada has got little tiny rules to govern us. So this has crippled the sex workers' rights movement for years. We can't reach consensus on how to move forward, so we were hoping that this cooperative model may be a way for localized groups to prioritize what they need most. During the project Leading the Way, during 2006 and 2007, Vancouver sex workers worked hard to create a framework for our cooperative, and we were officially incorporated as Canada's first sex worker cooperative last year in February, and are now known as the West Coast Cooperative of Sex Industry Professionals. Our cooperative will enable a number of issues. I'm sure you've all heard about the controversial Olympic brothel that doesn't exist. It's a lie and it's a fundraising tactic. What we are focused on is arts, catering, consulting, and publishing, because these are alternative sources of income and for a number of other reasons. And of course, the girls in the downtown east side really need a safe place to work. And so that was what the cooperative safe work environment was supposed to look like. So I'm gonna pass it back to Reva now.
Great, thanks, Sue. Okay, so I wanted to look at risk and safety from a sex industry worker's perspective. So I thought, let's define risk. Instead of going to sources within academia, I thought to look at dictionary.com. So the definition for risk is the exposure to the chance of injury or loss. Risk assessment is defined as an estimate of the likelihood of adverse effects. And in my review of risk assessment strategies, these are the four main things: identify the hazards, identify who might be harmed and how, implement strategies to mitigate that harm, and monitor and review. Really clear, 1, 2, 3, 4. But the issues that came up for me at the time was who identifies what the hazards are, who decides what kinds of people deserve protections and which are expendable, and whose interests are served by the strategies that are developed. And we all know who's being monitored, it's all of us. Sex workers themselves are seen as the hazard. Their existence represents risk, the exposure to the chance of injury or loss, as far as the larger community is concerned. So if sex workers remain the risk, then their perspectives will never be included in anti-violence strategies. The idea of defining certain groups as embodying risk for society is very common. It happens because we live in a fear-based society. And it also happens because fear is essential for social control, and it also happens because fear is profitable, but I won't go there today. But during defining certain groups as risk has been played and replayed throughout our collective history. So here's a list: during colonialism, the natives, regulating indigenous sexuality, alcohol, and they thought prohibition would have been the response to that. Lower class incorrigible white women, the communists, Jewish people, immigrants, colored people, drug users, even marijuana smokers, if you're in here. The hippies, then the hippies went to university. Hello. And there's homosexuals, and it's like, run, the lesbians are coming. Street gangs, migrant workers, foreign workers who steal the exported jobs, squeegee kids, and the poor. So sex workers just join a long list of vilified populations, but my point here is that those who define who is the risk rarely changes, but those who are defined or described as the risk often do. We have to wonder who's not on the list and why that is. Let's leave that for the men's washroom. So, returning to dictionary.com again for a definition of safety. Oh, you did? Okay, great, thank you. Safety was a state of being safe or freedom from risk. So I'm arguing that if sex workers are the risk and safety for the community means freedom from risk, then risk assessment strategies have to be aimed at eliminating the risk or eliminating sex workers. And this is happening, especially for street-level survival workers. There's many strategies that do this, may not have been their intention, but one example is the communicating law, which Stu mentioned earlier, known as Section 213 of the Criminal Code, enacted in 1985, coincidentally right before Expo. It criminalizes the communication for the purposes of prostitution in a public place or a place visible to the public. But what this law does is it forces sex workers to approach vehicles and say things like, "You want a party," instead of negotiating their price, the location, the duration, what's on their menu, those kinds of things that create the meeting of the minds that's necessary in any sort of contracting or transaction. What happens is that the person with the money has the power. And so the date could assume that his $100 pays for a hell of a lot more than it actually does. And that's when situational violence occurs. So Sue did mention that before the 213 legislation, there was 11 workers that were murdered, and just in the 15-year period after the legislation, 101 workers were murdered, and that doesn't include those that were missing, those that experienced violence. So, yeah, you'll get into all the trauma effects. So sex workers suffer the highest rates of rapes and assaults of any population in Canadian society. And we know in this province what happens when sex workers fall outside of our social protection. They're preyed upon. Sex workers have defined their risk, and they've done this in one of our reports. We did some research a couple of years back. It was called From the Curb, and it was a report on violence and domestic trafficking. And we asked them to name who poses risks to you. And they named rapists, murderers, customers that pay for services and think that they own them, the public who laugh at them, who throw things, vigilantes, and in particular, female residents. We asked them to name the conditions that create risk in their environments. And they said things like poor lighting, no safe place to go at night indoors, not being allowed to work in high traffic areas, so the isolation, the lack of hotels to work out of, so they're working in customers' cars, lack of phones, lack of response to calls for help, dealing with customers with mental health and alcohol and drug abuse issues, poverty, and of course, competition. When we asked sex workers why they felt like they were the victims or the targets of violence, they said things like, quote, "They pick us up and harm us working girls because we're lower class. Otherwise, they do this to their wives." Another quote, "It's easier to get away with hurting sex workers because we're not worth anything." Overwhelmingly, sex workers define violence against them and their social group as a hate crime. They see this as violence based on discrimination, they see this as discrimination based on occupation. And what we're calling for is, what we're saying is that their leadership is essential in developing programs for safety, defining risk, developing strategies, because we have to mitigate harm as defined by that population and not as defined by those outside of that population. So I'll pass it to Sue, and she'll talk about post-traumatic stress, and I'll come back to close.
So when you begin to think in the broad spectrum of terms and the harms and risks that our community face, whether it's systematic, emotional, or physical violence, we have to look at what needs to be done to reduce these risks and to move towards meaningful support for sex industry community members. So during the BC Coalition's Confronting Bad Dates project, we collaborated with all kinds of different stakeholders on this, and it was identified that provincial victim services were unable to collaborate on strategies like the redesign and distribution of a new bad date sheet and a 1-800 number for sex workers to report violence against them. The Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General Victim Support Services were largely unknown and had barriers to accessibility for our community members as well. Sex workers who had past experiences with victim services had shared their identity as a sex worker with victim services said that had either limited or eliminated their chances to receive supports, inclusive of counseling or compensation. These issues led to victim services attendance at the Confronting Bad Dates March 27 multi-stakeholder meeting, and later collaboration on victimization issues among sex workers. With financial support from the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General, we built monumental alliances, and we held some workshops with all stakeholders to try to, in the area of post-traumatic stress, and we engaged with some experts. So, is that 31? Yeah, there you go. Members of the coalition reviewed and vetted all of the ministry's information on how to access these services, and we put it together in a package called the 411, which was in your conference packages, just so that it's accessible for sex workers and puts it in plain language what they can expect when trying to deal with the justice system. Also, during these meetings, sorry, you're confusing me, babe. Are you there? Okay. We also had the privilege of funding two meetings between, first of all, frontline support workers and the expert in post-traumatic stress, as well as with sex workers and the expert in post-traumatic stress. Some of the discoveries we made during those meetings were sex workers learned that very little work has been done to research the levels of post-traumatic stress experienced by sex industry workers, in particular those who work in a dangerous street-level environment. Some sex workers have been on the street for more than 30 years and had witnessed and endured unimaginable violence and hardship. Sex workers expressed that this environment was akin to a war zone, and that levels of post-traumatic stress disorder affecting us could be compared to those affecting soldiers who had served in war, Vietnam War veterans, or Holocaust survivors. Sex workers now understand addiction as a symptom or coping mechanism for their post-traumatic stress, and as such, mandatory sobriety to access services become harmful to those using drugs or alcohol as a coping mechanism. These barriers are seen as one of the greatest contributors to society's failure to address these issues for sex workers and to provide meaningful support without compromising our emotional and safety and health. Frontline support workers express frustration at the gaps that exist in services, of course, mandatory sobriety, and sex worker support agencies expressed how the lack of sex worker-specific programming creates problems for finding safe places for sex workers. The full report is in that package again at the front, out on the tables. You can grab a copy if you'd like to. So the information provided by the psychologist was in direct conflict with the recommended treatments for psychological injury. For example, post-traumatic stress disorder was noted as being cumulative. However, those who experience violence over long periods of time and who have and who access victim services for compensation must attribute their trauma to one specific incident. So because they can't attribute your trauma to one incident, then you don't qualify. In order to recognize post-traumatic stress disorder among sex workers and provide them with the counseling and support they require, more research needs to be done to define this disorder among sex workers. With imperial evidence and all these sorts of things, new strategies can emerge, and we can, of course, move forward. We believe that a series of focus groups that engaged all stakeholders, including criminal justice, corrections, sex workers themselves, frontline support agencies, everybody, to sit down in a sort of global cafe style would really work to help to fill these gaps, identify these gaps, and come together and develop new strategies and best practice, capture best practices, because a lot of these things are not official. We've got, of course, another proposal in front of the ministry, and we're really hoping that that's going to come through for us as well. So here we go. Abstinence-based funding environments is very challenging, especially with a conservative government once again in power, to try to move forward when everything that they do is about get off drugs, detox. You got to be clean before you can get counseling. Clean, clean, clean. Well, we know this is in conflict. We know that this isn't the way to do things, right? And in fact, if you interrupt a person's coping mechanism, you put them at further risk. You can, if before they're ready to deal with their injuries, you interrupt that coping mechanism, their emotional stability becomes at risk, their symptoms could escalate, and at the very least, it'll impede their recovery very, very seriously. Some programs have found a way to sort of skirt around this, however, by dealing with relapse. So, if a person has sort of fallen off the wagon and used, rather than cut them off from supports, the reasons for relapse are examined and addressed. New coping strategies or alternatives to self-harm can be implemented over time. Slowly but surely, they can help to limit a person's exposure to those environments that trigger them and help them to learn to live with their injuries. So yes, get clean, but with attention to relapse. This way, abstinence-based funding pockets become available, but yet you can still respect the symptoms of trauma survivors. Physical contact should be a last resort. Touching, manhandling of the victims of violent crimes can further traumatize them. No-brainer, right? Members shared how being grabbed or restrained triggered them and contributed to their lack of trust in the systems designed to protect them. The explosive rage and extreme passion of trauma survivors when triggered can be really difficult. Monitor their safety, but maintain your distance. Restraining a trauma survivor during an episode can prolong the event, make it worse, definitely prolong their recovery, and in the most extreme cases can send them over the edge. Only in the very last possible resort should you grab somebody who's in a triggered moment. Of course, there's overprescribing, underprescribing. We hear both things from people, that they're not given enough pain medication, or that somebody will complain that, oh, my friend is always high because they're being overprescribed. In the end, you have to just sort of look at the person that you're dealing with, each case individually, and try to assess what is the proper approach. Too much, and you're feeding them, enabling them. Too little, and they'll be forced to engage in high-risk behavior like sex work to try to supplement their medication, which is risky and dangerous. And if we're talking about trying to limit risk, give them their pills, I'd rather see that than see them out there trying to get it the hard way. So there is a tendency to blame the victims in these situations. A person who's been abused repeatedly is sometimes mistaken as somebody with weak character. Because of their chronic victimization in the past, survivors have been misdiagnosed by healthcare providers as having borderline dependent or masochistic personality disorder. When survivors are faulted with the symptoms they experience as a result of victimizations, they're being unjustly blamed. Awareness is the key here. You have to make yourself aware of the symptoms and all the available treatments. When a person understands their symptoms, it's empowering. I know it has been for me. I've been able to control my explosive rage, which I think is really funny. I named that disorder unofficially a couple years ago. And truly, the researchers hope that this new diagnosis will prevent the harms of the past, where if a person is diagnosed as schizophrenic and given a mind-altering, chemically shifting, brain-changing drug when they don't need it, this is causing mental illness, and this is putting people in harm's way. So just, even though it's difficult, try to stick it out and try to see each situation for what it is.
Okay, thank you, Sue. So I just wanted to close with highlighting a few things that's in the handout for the coalition. Just wanted to share that review that sex workers are a diverse population and they are not risk. They work and make decisions and in environments and under conditions that pose risks to their health and their safety and their rights. And fortunately or unfortunately, sex industry work is income. So any strategies, any anti-violence work, any health and safety initiatives that come into play must also be based in their economic security. The risk assessment within the sex industry, as I alluded to before, tends to be done by people that are outside of the sex industry. But sex workers need more opportunities to define their harms and participate in developing programs in their communities. And in the big picture, professional knowledge and knowledge gained through lived experience in the sex industry must be merged. We all need to find opportunities where this combination can be realized, and I think our 411 document that we were able to do with the help of the Solicitor General is a really good example of that merging. I say this a lot, but sex workers are a barometer. Their health and safety and wellness are indicative of our social programs and our supports, as well as our values. And if our policies and resources are not invested in supporting those among us that have the least influence and the least power, then what the hell are we doing? So we need to take care of the least among us, because when we do, all of us benefit. Breathe. Quiet room. Breathe. Sorry. So what we're asking for is reminiscent of what Martin Luther King asked for during the civil rights movement more than 40 years ago, and that is for those who are described as the problem to participate in defining the problem so that we can all be part of creating solutions. And this is a room that's full of solutions from all over the continent. And we both wish you well in finding solutions for your workplace safety issues, as well as solutions that come up from your conference participants. We've seen with the new president-elect in the United States that new kinds of experiences are being recognized and accepted into leadership. And we're also calling for the same kinds of inclusions, where sex workers would be embraced as formal contributors to anti-violence strategies, but also anti-violence discourse and policy, as well as its practice. Thank you.